Alone on the edge of the marshlands, veteran Dorian Keats believed the brutal coastal storm was the worst danger creeping toward his fragile new life. He was wrong. Inside the ruined cabin, his steady, disciplined partner, Bram, the aging German shepherd who had never panicked a day in his life, began pacing in tight circles, whining at the old brick water reservoir, as if sensing something far older than the storm outside. This wasn't fear, this was a warning. Dorian felt the scar along his jaw tighten, the same instinct that once kept him alive overseas. What could be hidden beneath sealed brick and decades of silence? Something only a loyal dog could detect. A secret buried, protected, and worth killing for. If this story draws you in, please support us by subscribing to the channel. Dawn mist clung to the brackish marshland like a low, trembling veil. The old courthouse of Cypress Bend, weather-stained brick, sagging gutters, and a clock tower that hadn't told the right time in 15 years, felt like a place that remembered too much. Inside, the stale air carried a mix of wet paper, old sweat, and resignation. It was the smell of a town that had learned to keep its head down. Dorian Keats sat on the last bench, the way he had once chosen the corner of military transport planes, where he could see everything and be seen by no one. At 43, he wore his age not as decay, but as quiet proof he'd survived what others hadn't. His face, angular and sun-cut, carried shadows beneath the cheekbones. A faint scar traced from the lift of his jaw toward his right ear, a remnant of a convoy explosion in Fallujah. His brown-blonde hair, trimmed close out of long habit, was streaked with silver at the temples. His eyes, icy blue, watchful, half-tired, absorbed the room with a caution that had become instinct long before he realized it. At his feet lay Bram, the 9-year-old German shepherd, whose silver-gray coat gleamed even in the dim courthouse light. Bram's frame was strong but beginning to soften around the edges. The years of military service had carved discipline into his posture and intelligence into the amber of his eyes. He rested with a dignified stillness, but every few seconds his tail made a slow sweep against the floor, an unconscious gesture toward the only human he now trusted without reservation. Bram had been Dorian's partner during a tour in Kandahar, where a collapsed building and 2 days trapped in dust and darkness had forged a bond deeper than language. Dorian still woke some nights with the memory of Bram's warm body pressed against him under the rubble, keeping him breathing. It was why the dog was more than a companion. He was the last anchor Dorian possessed in a life that had drifted off its old maps. The auctioneer, Melvin Rask, shuffled to his podium. Melvin was a soft, round man in his 50s, with thinning ginger hair and a perpetually flushed face, the kind that suggested an unspoken allergy to stress. He tried to appear authoritative, but his watery gray eyes darted nervously whenever he felt a shift in the room. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and overworked. Next item, Parcel 14B, commonly called Old Harrow Place. A rustle moved through the benches. A few locals exchanged glances, half warning, half pity. Dorian noticed the whispers, but none of them surprised him. People in small towns loved their legends almost as much as their silence. And Old Harrow Place, perched at the edge of the tidal marsh, had gathered more rumors than the courthouse had collected dust. Melvin continued reading from his paperwork, voice droning. 1 wooden residence, condition, severe decay, unpaid taxes, 15 years, starting bid, $500. 500. Dorian lifted his hand with calm deliberation, as if he were ordering coffee rather than altering the course of his life. He felt Bram shift beside him, alert yet relaxed. No one else raised a hand. Not a single person even twitched. Melvin blinked, surprised but relieved. 500. Do I hear 6? 550. Anyone? Nothing. Not even the bored speculators who had fought tooth and nail earlier for a broken tractor and a boat engine. Melvin swallowed. Going once, going twice, sold to, Mr. Keats. The gavel dropped with a timid crack, like it was afraid to make noise. As Dorian walked to the front to sign the deed, he felt eyes following him, not hostile exactly, but full of unease. He accepted the papers, the ink damp beneath his steady thumb, and headed toward the exit, with Bram pacing loyally at his knee. Outside, the humid air wrapped around him like a damp shroud. The sky was the yellow-gray color of old bruise water, and the distant smell of diesel from the shrimp boats drifted in on the wind. He'd barely reached the steps when a voice stopped him. "Son, you sure you want that place?" The speaker was Edwin Kerr, owner of the only general store in Cypress Bend. Edwin was in his 70s with a wiry frame and a back permanently curved from decades unloading supply crates. His skin was darkened by sun and wind. A network of deep creases framed his eyes, giving him a perpetually concerned expression. He had a gentle, practical manner, one shaped by a life of fixing things others gave up on. Today, however, anxiety tugged at the corners of his gaze. Beside him stood two marsh farmers, both lean men in mud-stained jeans. They didn't introduce themselves. Their silence was warning enough. Edwin rubbed the back of his neck. That house. Bad history. He paused as if tasting whether to continue. The man who lived there before, Ephraim Locke, bright fellow, too curious for his own good, reporter from up north, tall, dark hair, thin face, talked like someone always thinking 3 steps ahead. Near the end, he walked around looking haunted. Then one day, gone, boat still tied up, supper still on the table. Dorian listened, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He'd met men like Ephraim Locke in every country he'd served in, men who pushed too far into truths stronger people pretended not to see. They disappeared the same way, without footprints, without shouts, without justice. Edwin continued, "Folks started saying Harrow Place is cursed. Some say you can hear footsteps where nobody stands. Others say late at night the lights shine though no wiring works. But most folks," his voice lowered, "most folks think Ephraim found something he wasn't meant to." Dorian nodded once, not dismissive, but unshaken. "Appreciate the warning." Edwin sighed, recognizing the immovable kind. "Well, you'll need supplies. Come by before sundown." Dorian walked to his truck, the old vehicle, groaning under the weight of its years. Bram jumped into the passenger seat with practiced grace, tail thumping once as if to say, "Whatever comes, we face it." The engine rumbled to life, and together they drove toward the distant band of mangrove trees, where the marshland turned black-green and the horizon smelled of salt, oil, and quiet danger. Dorian kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on Bram's head, his mind circling the same thought. Haunted places don't scare me, the living do. And as the road narrowed into a thin gravel path swallowed by reeds, he felt something stir inside him, not fear, but the quiet tremor of a purpose he hadn't felt in years. Tonight he and Bram would reach Old Harrow Place, and whatever waited there, he was ready. The late afternoon heat pressed against the marshland like a damp fist when Dorian and Bram stepped through the warped doorway of Old Harrow Place. Inside, the air felt stagnant, thick with the faint tang of mold and the older, sharper scent of something interrupted, something unfinished. The wooden walls were warped in places, bowed by years of humidity. The paint had peeled into curled edges resembling flaking skin. Still, the structure held a stubborn strength, as if it had refused to collapse simply to keep its secrets intact. Dorian's boots thudded softly across the buckled floorboards as he moved through the single-room interior. His movements were methodical, shaped by years of clearing ghosted-out buildings in foreign deserts. His gaze skimmed the surfaces, the cracked ceramic mug with dried coffee clinging like rust to the bottom, the plaid jacket hung behind the door, shoulders still keeping the shape of the man who last wore it, the weathered notebook on the counter, pages half-curled as though someone had lifted it moments ago and intended to return. Ephraim Locke had not walked out of this place. He had been pulled away from it. Bram sniffed a narrow trail along the wall, his muscles taut beneath his silver-gray coat. The 9-year-old shepherd carried himself with the dignity of a veteran, but his ears pricked sharply now, eyes narrowing, tail lowering into a tense line. His paws pressed lightly but deliberately on the cement slab beneath the old brick water reservoir, a structure that looked far too reinforced for a simple household function. "You smell something, boy?" Dorian asked quietly, his tone steady but watchful. His icy blue eyes tracked Bram's movements the way a trained marksman followed the path of wind through tall grass. The dog's answer was a low, throaty whine, a sound Dorian had only heard when danger slept beneath the surface. Bram pressed his nose toward a hairline crack in the concrete, clawing at it with increasing urgency. Not frantic, not fearful, insistent, focused. Old instincts surged to the forefront of Dorian's mind. Bram had behaved like this only twice before, once when he alerted their unit to a hidden pressure plate, and once when he found an underground weapons cache disguised as a shepherd's lap. In both cases, Bram's certainty had saved lives. Dorian knelt beside the reservoir, running his calloused fingers across the cracked line. The cement here differed from the rest, darker, smoother, as if poured later with a different purpose. He pulled the combat knife from his belt and scraped the seam. The material flaked in thin, rubbery strips, not standard cement, pitch mixed with grit. A seal, not a bond. "Good work," he murmured to Bram, who stood ready beside him, trembling with the expectancy of purpose. "Let's see what they tried to hide." He retrieved a rust-splotched crowbar from beside the door and wedged it beneath the edge of the slab. The concrete groaned. In protest, vibrating through the tool and into Dorian's arm, sweat formed along his temples as he leveraged his weight against it. Finally, with a violent pop, a corner of the slab cracked upward. Dust swirled, carrying the faint metallic smell of old secrecy. He lifted the block aside with strained breath and stared into the cavity below, a perfectly rectangular chamber about 3 feet deep, lined with old brick. Inside rested a military-issue metal storage box, dark green, edges dented, beside a stack of leather-bound journals tied with fraying twine. Bram lowered his head, sniffing the air above the opening, then exhaled sharply as if confirming this was what he had searched for. Dorian reached in and lifted the journals first. They were heavier than expected, swollen slightly from humidity but intact. The leather was dark brown, worn smooth, edges softened by handling. Ephraim Locke had written in a tight, controlled script, the handwriting of a man taught to separate emotion from documentation. And yet, as Dorian flipped open the first page, the ink strokes trembled ever so slightly, as though Locke had written them while glancing over his shoulder. Before he could read more, he heard the faint crunch of gravel outside, a subtle shift in sound that only someone trained to hear threat in silence would detect. Bram's ears shot upward, his posture sharpened, head angled toward the door. In one fluid motion, Dorian closed the journal, placed it on the counter, and moved to the window. He cleared a small circle of grime with his thumb and peered out. A woman stood near the sagging fence line, a stranger. She was tall and narrow-shouldered, with a long, dark braid falling down her back. Her skin held a light olive tone, and she wore a simple linen blouse tucked into faded work jeans. She carried herself with the cautious poise of someone accustomed to walking alone. Her name, she would later introduce, was Lennon Hale, a wildlife biologist working in the marshes, though this first moment offered only hints of her nature. Steady eyes, cautious steps, a face that seemed shaped by long hours of wind and sun. Bram huffed, neither aggressive nor welcoming, just alert. Dorian opened the door part way, keeping his body squared, his presence controlled. "Can I help you?" Lennon paused several paces away, her green eyes flicking from him to Bram, then to the house behind him. "I heard someone bought Harrow Place," she said, her voice low. pitched like someone who preferred truth over small talk. Nobody's lived here since Ephraim disappeared. Her gaze lingered on Dorian's steady posture and the way his hand rested near his hip. Habit, not hostility. She seemed to understand the silent warning, but didn't retreat. "I'm not here to bother you," she continued. "I just needed to make sure, well, that someone real was here." Dorian's brow shifted a fraction, suspicion settling but not sharpening. "Someone real?" Lennon hesitated. "Ephraim was studying the marsh. He told me he found something wrong with the water system. Days later he vanished. I always felt—" She swallowed. The wrong people were watching him. Her honesty didn't feel rehearsed, nor did her fear. Before Dorian could respond, Bram pressed closer to him, body rigid. Lennon's eyes widened slightly. "Something wrong with your dog?" "Not with him," Dorian said, his tone turning flat and cold. "With whatever's coming." In the distance, an engine rumbled, slow, heavy, official, the kind of sound that signaled authority but not safety. Sheriff Dugan Pike's county-issued SUV appeared around the bend, its tires grinding against the gravel road that led to the house. Lennon's breath hitched. "I shouldn't be here. Pike doesn't like questions." She slipped back into the trees and disappeared with a quiet swiftness that suggested she had learned survival through necessity. Dorian closed the door and moved to hide the uncovered cavity beneath the reservoir. Bram circled him anxiously, ears pinned, body coiled. Dorian replaced the slab partially, enough to disguise the opening but not seal it. Then, as the SUV door slammed outside, he steadied himself. The Marshland had begun speaking through whispers under concrete, and strangers arriving with fear in their eyes. And Dorian Keats understood, with a clarity he hadn't felt since wartime, that whatever Ephraim Locke had died for was no longer buried. It had surfaced, and now it belonged to him. The rain arrived in sheets, sweeping across Cypress Bend with the raw force of a season waking from its long sleep. It poured from a sky the color of old pewter, and the marsh responded with its chorus of croaking frogs and restless waves slapping the muddy banks. When Dorian stepped onto the sagging porch of Old Harrow Place, his boots sank slightly into the soaked wood, swollen from the humidity. The rain hammered down against the tin roof in frantic silver streaks, and Bram stood beside him, tall silver-gray fur darkened toward charcoal with the wet, ears pivoting at every shift of wind. Dorian had barely finished securing the loose shutters when the gravel road crackled under heavy tires. Sheriff Dugan Pike's county SUV rolled into view, headlights smeared by the rain. Pike emerged with the unhurried heaviness of a man accustomed to asserting presence simply by standing still. He was broad-shouldered, thick around the middle, his uniform taut across his torso. His face, square-jawed but softened by age, bore a permanently reddish hue, like someone who spent a lifetime barking orders or drinking cheap bourbon, perhaps both. His dark hair was cut short enough to hide a growing bald patch, and his mustache was a thick bristle that failed to disguise the thin-lipped tension beneath. His eyes, small and the color of muddy water, carried no warmth despite the practiced smile tugging at his mouth. "Well, Mr. Keats," Pike greeted, raising his voice above the storm, "checking in on the newest resident of our fine marsh." The smile stayed in place, but the muscles behind it never moved. Bram stepped forward, body rigid, a low rumble crawling from his chest. It was not an aggressive sound, but a warning, measured, directed, purposeful. Pike glanced at the dog with thinly veiled distaste. "Fine animal you've got," he muttered, though his tone suggested the opposite. "But you'll want to keep him close. Folks don't tend to last long out here without making friends." The sheriff's gaze swept the house briefly, lingering an extra heartbeat on the partially dirt-streaked floor visible through the doorway, as though searching for something out of place. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Dorian asked evenly, his voice steady despite the electric hum in on his nerves. His scar, running from jawline to ear, itched the way it did whenever danger stood close but unspoken. Pike folded his arms, rain glistening off the shoulders of his jacket. Just wanted to remind you, this property's got a tangled past. Paperwork errors, ownership disputes, folks disappearing. He shrugged, feigning concern. Be a real shame if you got caught up in old troubles that weren't yours. Bram's growl deepened. Pike paused, then added with a condescending tilt of his head, "Storms picking up, roads get slick, tires get cut on sharp branches." His gaze dropped briefly to Dorian's truck. "Stay safe now." He turned, squelching, back to his SUV. A moment later, the vehicle reversed down the path, its taillights vanishing into curtains of rain. When Dorian walked around to check the truck, he found a surgical, precise slash across the rear tire. No accident of the storm. The marsh had offered its first warning. The next morning rose in a brutal contrast. Sun beating down with a humid, oppressive heat. Shrimp boats droned across the distant waterways, and dragonflies hovered above waterlogged grass. Dorian repaired the tire using the spare kit, sweat tracing lines across the dust on his face. Bram paced the length of the yard, ears vigilant, occasionally stopping to sniff the air, as though expecting someone to return. At noon, the steady hum of an approaching boat cut across the water. At first, Dorian assumed it was a fisherman, but the sleek, polished motorboat that emerged from the reeds told another story entirely. Its hull was glossy, pearl white, its engine too clean, too new, too expensive for these parts. It glided toward the rickety dock like a predator slipping into shallow waters. A man stepped out. Harlan Vexler. Vexler looked like he had been carved to fit inside corporate brochures, tall, lean, and crisp. His hair, dark blonde with meticulous silver streaks at the sides, was combed back as if neither humidity nor wind dared to touch it. His skin bore the smooth, well-maintained tan of someone who spent just enough time outdoors to look rugged without earning a single blister. He wore a pale linen shirt, sleeves rolled to show toned forearms, and sleek, dark slacks entirely unsuited for mud. His jawline was sharp, his smile sharper still, glinting with the polish of expensive dentistry and a lifetime of calculated charm. "Harlan Vexler," he announced with effortless confidence as he stepped onto the porch. "CEO of Meridian Petro. And you, I assume, are Mr. Dorian Keats." His voice had the smooth timbre of someone accustomed to being listened to. Dorian gave no handshake. Bram positioned himself between the two men, tail low, amber eyes locked onto Vexler in the way only an experienced service dog could warn, "This is not a friend." Vexler's smile didn't falter, though his gaze flicked to Bram with the slightest twitch of annoyance. "Beautiful animal," he said. "A bit outdated, perhaps, but loyal. I like loyalty." Dorian's expression remained unchanging. "Why are you here?" "Straight to business," Vexler chuckled, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. "I respect that. Here's the truth, Mr. Keats. This land is important to my company. We've been trying to acquire Old Harrow Place for years." He reached into his pocket and produced a thick envelope. "So I'm offering you $50,000, cash, today." The envelope sagged with weight. Dorian didn't look at it. "No." Vexler blinked, not in surprise, but in calculation. "It's more than fair, considering the, strange history of this property." Dorian stepped forward. "It's not for sale." The pleasant veneer slipped. Vexler's eyes, cold blue, stripped of charm, fixed on him like a blade. "You don't understand what you're involving yourself in," he said softly. "This isn't a place for heroes, and everyone who tried to protect this house before you." He let the sentence drift, unfinished but heavy. Bram stepped closer, teeth barely visible beneath curled lip. Vexler exhaled sharply, then straightened his shirt, smile returning like a mask. "Think about it, Mr. Keats. I'd hate for complications to arise." He boarded his boat, pushing off with an elegant, practiced motion. The motor roared, sending a spray of white water behind him as he vanished down the marsh channel. Dorian watched until the boat disappeared, the envelope still untouched on the porch. Bram nudged his leg, sensing the tension radiating through him. Dorian lifted the envelope, walked to the water's edge, and dropped it in. The bills inside stained, swelled, and sank. The marsh accepted the bribe and buried it. That night, as darkness thickened and the heat gave way to the pulse of humidity, Dorian sat at the old table under the dim lantern. Frogs called from the reeds, and the distant thump of an oil pump echoed like a slow heartbeat. Bram rested beside him, head lifted every time the wind shifted. Dorian opened Ephraim Locke's journals again, flipping through the meticulous entries of contaminated water samples, coordinated harassment, and quiet threats. Every line amplified the weight in Dorian's chest, not fear, but responsibility, the kind that clung to him the way battlefield dust once had. He closed the journal and stood. Tomorrow wouldn't wait. By midnight, he and Bram walked the dirt path toward the truck. They drove 15 miles to the nearest town library, a squat brick building lit by a single flickering lamp. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and old cooling units. Dorian used an anonymous email, scanned Locke's documents, encrypted them using a code only 2 people on Earth shared, and sent them to his former squadmate, Ira Maddox, now an investigative reporter hardened by war and sharpened by truth. When the files uploaded, Dorian felt the first crack of a new storm forming, one far more dangerous than rain. By dawn, he knew he was no longer a homeowner. He was a target. The tropical depression should have been nothing more than a passing tantrum of the Gulf, but by nightfall, Cypress Bend had become a world painted in bruised violet and bruised silence. The wind slammed into the mangrove line with a sound like tearing canvas, pushing the tide up the banks until dark water lapped at the lowest porch steps of Old Harrow Place. Rain hammered sideways, so dense it blurred the boundary between sky and marsh. In the dim lantern glow inside the cabin, Dorian Keats worked with the focused calm of a man who had weathered storms far worse, storms made of metal and sand, and men trying to kill him. The old scar along his jaw twinged as he fastened the last board across the rickety window frame. It was an old habit, pain before danger. Bram circled the perimeter of the room, silver-gray coat bristling with static tension, paws silent but purposeful. Every few steps he stopped to stare toward the direction of the marsh, ears pricked, body angled in that familiar alertness that had once saved platoons. The 9-year-old shepherd was older now, but in this storm his youthful fire flickered alive beneath the seasoned calm. Dorian watched him and felt the shift in the air, a pressure beneath the storm, something that carried intention. "Easy, boy," Dorian murmured, even as he felt his own pulse elevate. Instinct never left a soldier. It only slumbered until men like Pike or Vexler shook it awake. Lightning spidered across the sky, illuminating the marsh in an eerie instant. Mangroves bent low, water churning, and something else, a faint ripple of movement far down the narrow inlet. A boat, engines cut, using the wind to drift silently. Bram's growl began low and rose until it became a vibrating hum through the floorboards. Then suddenly, he lunged toward the front door, claws clicking in a rapid staccato. The hair along his spine shot up in a sharp ridge. A heartbeat later came the metallic whisper at the lock. A pick sliding, coaxing, testing. Someone was on the porch. Dorian extinguished the lantern with a flick, plunging the cabin into darkness. His breathing slowed, muscles tightened. The shadows embraced him like an old uniform. Bram melted into the darkness too, positioning himself along the entrance path, silent, lethal. A thin line of yellow appeared as the door cracked open. A silhouette leaned in, careful and cautious, a gloved hand reaching into the dark. Dorian fired a single warning shot beside the intruder's ear, the blast echoing through the storm. At the same instant, Bram launched with surgical precision, 40 kilograms of trained force slamming into the attacker's legs. The man yelped, stumbled backward, lost balance. The storm swallowed the sound as he crashed against the drenched boards. Then he fled, scrambling into the howling rain, slipping off the porch and hurrying toward the boat. Dorian caught only the outline of a dark jacket and the glint of metal at the man's belt before he vanished into the curtain of water. But danger never traveled alone. Minutes later, after the boat retreated beyond hearing, the marsh fell into a deceptive quiet. Dorian knew better. The enemy had tested the front. They would not try it again. He moved through the cabin, checking every boarded window, every seam, aware that the storm outside masked more than weather. The wind rattled the rafters. Rain hammered the roof like thrown gravel. Then glass shattered. A bottle hit the far side of the room hard enough to splinter wood. A second followed through another window. The acrid scent hit instantly, gasoline blooming across the floorboards. Before the liquid even finished spreading, a flaming rag sailed through the broken window with a hiss. When it landed, the explosion of orange flame erupted upward like an enraged beast. Heat punched Dorian backward. The air itself became fire. Bram barked once, sharp, urgent, terrified, and pressed against Dorian's hip, the way he had the day they were trapped under rubble in Kandahar. Smoke filled the cabin at terrifying speed, choking, thick, unforgettable. Fire crawled upward along the wall paneling, devouring the aged wood with frantic hunger. Dorian coughed once, shielding his mouth with his sleeve. If he stayed, the blaze would swallow the evidence hidden under the reservoir, swallow the journals spread on the table, swallow him. He scanned the room through a soldier's lens, noting exits, angles, shadows. A shape moved in the smoke. A man collapsed near the back door, clutching a bleeding leg. The injured intruder, perhaps thrown by Bram's earlier strike, had not fully escaped. His face was half covered by a black mask, his hair dark and wet, his eyes glazed with pain. He attempted to crawl, leaving smears of blood across the floor. Dorian grabbed him by the back of the jacket and dragged him toward the rear port exit, not out of mercy, but strategy. He flung the wounded man toward the outside. "Your employer ordered this," he said, through clenched teeth. "He can come collect you." Bram barked again, pacing urgently toward the front door, now engulfed in rolling flame. The fire crackled and roared, licking the beams overhead. Heat pulsed like a living heartbeat. Dorian knew what had to be done. If he stayed, he died. If he ran straight into gunfire. The enemies had positioned themselves beyond the porch, waiting for the fire to flush him out like game. A soldier's mind chose survival through movement. He tied the damp cloth over his face, gripped Bram's scruff, and pushed through the growing inferno. Flames nipped at his jacket, seared the sleeves, and smoke clawed into his throat. With a final forceful kick, he smashed the burning door open. The world outside exploded in contrasts. Thick rain, howling wind, the smell of burning timber, and the gleam of weapons aimed from the shadowed mangrove bank. Silhouettes moved with the precision of hired men. One raised his rifle. Dorian didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, pulling Bram with him, using the rain and smoke as cover, the instinct to survive overriding all else. The fire behind him roared its last warning before the roof began to collapse inward with a thunderous groan. But Dorian and Bram were already in the storm, where fire could not reach, but danger certainly could, and the night had only begun. The storm had spent itself by the time the sky began to pale, but its rage still clung to the mangroves and the soaked marsh like a dying curse. Smoke drifted from the blackened skeleton of old Harrow Place, its charred beams jutting upward like the ribs of some ancient creature washed ashore. Dorian Keats stood in the half-light, drenched, bruised, blood at his temple drying into a rusty streak. Bram pressed tightly against his leg, silver-gray fur soaked and heavy, sides heaving but eyes alert. They faced Harlan Vexler, who held his pistol level with the steady arrogance of a man accustomed to having the world obey him. "You're done, Keats!" Vexler screamed over the dying wind. His pristine linen shirt, once immaculate, hung torn, splattered with mud. His sculpted blonde hair stuck to his forehead now, revealing sharp cheekbones and a jaw clenched in fury. He exhaled raggedly, his polished confidence cracking. "The evidence is gone. Your house is gone, and after today you will be gone." Dorian didn't flinch. His icy blue eyes, steady even after surviving a burning home and a night hunted through the mangroves, locked onto Wexler with a tired calm. He'd seen men like him on foreign soil, men who thought power was the same as invincibility. He'd buried more than one. Then it came, the chopping blades of salvation. A roar tore across the sky, scattering the smoke like ash. A black helicopter hovered over the marsh, its searchlight slicing through the morning haze. Loud speakers thundered, "FBI, drop your weapons! You are surrounded!" Wexler spun, disbelief warping his normally polished features. More lights flooded the marsh as two Coast Guard boats cut through the inlet, their hulls splitting the water in clean, disciplined lines. Figures in tactical vests emerged from the grass and shadows as if conjured by the earth itself. Gunmen, those same silhouettes who'd thrown fire at Dorian's home hours earlier, froze in place. One dropped his rifle instantly. Another tried to run but sank knee-deep in the mud and lifted trembling hands. Only Wexler hesitated, jaw twitching, fingers whitening on the trigger. A voice carried across the marsh, steady, familiar. "I told you I'd get here, brother." Ira Maddox stepped from the nearest helicopter, wearing a dark windbreaker stamped with FBI press liaison. He looked nothing like the wiry soldier Dorian remembered from 12 years ago. Ira had aged into a wiry, sharp-jawed man with streaks of iron in his tightly curled black hair and thin lines at the corners of his dark eyes shaped by too many late nights studying corruption and not enough sleep. His posture held that same wiry readiness, though now tempered by the exhaustion of a man who'd spent years fighting wars made of paper and politics rather than bullets. Wexler barked a curse and raised his gun at Dorian, one last desperate act. Bram lunged forward with a ferocious snarl, placing himself directly between shooter and soldier. At the same moment, 3 red dots from FBI rifles converged on Wexler's chest. He froze at the touch of danger and finally let the pistol fall. It landed in the mud with a dull thud. Handcuffs clicked into place. Wexler, still seething, turned his head toward Dorian as agents marched him away. "This isn't over," he spat, voice low. "Men bigger than me are watching." But the morning swallowed his words. Hours later, the last of the flames were extinguished, and the sun rose fully over a calmer marsh. The wreckage of Old Harrow Place lay smoldering, but something survived. The brick water reservoir. Its charred base stood firm despite the collapse of the house around it. Dorian pried at the reservoir's false bottom, what remained of the cement he had once uncovered. Beneath it, untouched by fire or water, were Ephraim Locke's journals and the original metal case. Dorian exhaled a quiet breath of victory. Bram leaned his wet head against Dorian's thigh, tail sweeping the ash lightly. In the days that followed, the swamp town of Cypress Bend transformed. Federal teams swept the marshland with equipment Dorian had never seen used outside war zones. Water samples were collected. Hazardous waste barrels were unearthed from hidden pits. Sheriff Dugan Pike, his smugness dissolved into panic, was arrested at his office trying to shred documents. Other local officials followed, each one linked to Meridian Petro's chain of corruption. News crews arrived, drones hovered, environmental lawyers flocked like scavenger birds. Ira Maddox stood beside Dorian through much of it, lean, wiry, wearing a perpetual expression of focused irritation as he coordinated interviews and handed over Ephraim Locke's evidence. Ira's voice often carried the gravel of exhaustion, but his confidence never wavered. Locke wasn't paranoid, he told the investigators. He was the only one paying attention. Weeks passed. The marsh calmed. Fishermen returned to the waters. Children began catching frogs again in the shallows. The fear that once shaped the locals' silence slowly cracked like drying mud. And one morning, as the sun lifted into a clear blue sky, Ira approached Dorian with a newspaper folded under his arm. His usually serious face softened into a smirk. "They're calling you a hero," he said, holding up the front page. An artist's illustration showed Dorian with Bram at his side, mangroves sweeping behind them like a banner. Dorian snorted. "You know better." Ira laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Yeah, I do. That dog of yours is the hero." Dorian reached down, scratching Bram behind the ear. The dog's amber eyes warmed with that familiar, wordless affection. "Exactly." Instead of packing his truck and leaving, Dorian did something unexpected, even to himself. He stayed. On the cleared foundation of Old Harrow Place, he built a raised wooden house. Stronger beams, higher stilts, designed to withstand both storms and silence. Bram supervised every plank, every nail, claiming the porch as his throne before the final railings were even finished. Lennon Hale stopped by once, stepping out of the mangroves with her long braid damp from fieldwork. She looked at the new home with a small, tired smile. "Ephraim would have liked this," she murmured. Her green eyes reflected both grief and relief. Dorian nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement. When she left, Bram watched her go with ears perked until her footsteps faded. Evening settled into a peace Dorian had never known. The marsh glimmered gold, and the wind carried the tang of salt mixed with the smell of fresh-cut wood. Bram lay on the new porch, tail flicking whenever a boat engine hummed in the distance, alert but no longer on edge. Dorian sat beside him, feeling, for the first time in years, a sense of home rather than refuge. Here, amid water and wind and the ghost of a man who died for the truth, he found something worth staying for. Not redemption, not reinvention, simply purpose. And as the light rippled across Bram's aging silver coat, Dorian understood fully. Sometimes the thing that saves an entire land isn't a gun or a badge. Sometimes it's the quiet growl of a loyal heart refusing to let darkness settle. Sometimes, in the quiet places of the world, God sends his miracles not through thunder or lightning, but through the soft footsteps of a loyal dog and the steady heart of a weary man. What happened in Cypress Bend wasn't luck, and it wasn't coincidence. It was a reminder that when we stand for truth, when we protect the weak, speak up for the voiceless, and refuse to look away, the Lord walks beside us, even through the storms. And maybe, just maybe, he speaks through the growl of a faithful shepherd long before we recognize his warning. As you finish this story, may it remind you that courage still matters, goodness still wins, and miracles still appear in the most ordinary days of our lives. If this tale touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, loyalty, and the small miracles God sends our way. May the Lord bless you and keep you, protect your home, your family, and every loyal animal he places in your path. God bless you, and thank you for being part of our storytelling family.